Okay, so Hero's Journey. It is a literary but also literal narration of the ultimate transformation, becoming the best version of yourself. And so it's partly why we go and watch movies as well, right? Has anyone seen Harry Potter? Has anyone seen Lord of the Rings, right? These movies, they go and take our characters through an adventure where they transform themselves. Okay, so I have two examples on the board, but I also have my poster there of the hero's journey. And what you'll recognize right away is that it's a cycle, right? It's a circle. And this example we have on the right is pretty awesome because it shows how where you start is not where you end up. Typically, you end up in a better place than you start, assuming you go through these steps properly and thoroughly, right? So we can look at some of the stages, but we will be going over them. So some of the origins, it's extracted both from mythological stories and also from real human achievements. So many of these stories in the Bible, okay, they're a hero's journey. If you follow these characters through their life, you have stories of various heroes in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Egyptian. These characters are going through a transformative journey to, let's say, either resurrect themselves or to heal their community, whatever it is. Okay, and so this is Joseph Campbell, who popularized this story and who studied a lot of mythology. He wrote a book on this, and so he played a big role in making this whole hero's journey narrative popular. Okay, but other thinkers who helped were Sigmund Freud, who we talked about in this class, and Carl Jung as well. They did a lot to develop this concept of the hero's journey. Okay, so some examples and a question, who are your heroes, if anyone would like to share. Right, I have some examples over here and the next slide as well. But does anyone have a fictional or real life hero that they'd like to share? Are we all a little camera shy? That's okay. Does anyone recognize any of these characters? We've watched some movies with them. Right, okay. So we'll move on. So some of my personal examples or favorites. So Malcolm X, in terms of real life people, I very, very much admire his life's journey. You know, he was born, before he was born, his father was murdered, or right around his early life. He lived through the Great Depression. He was very young. He lived in a time in history, particularly in America, when race relations between the blacks and whites were very difficult. So he had a very rough childhood. He ended up resorting to a life of crime early on in his life. He had no real direction. Part of that was because when he told one of his teachers in a small white town that he wanted to be a lawyer, that teacher told him, well, you know, because you're black, you should look for something a little bit more fitting for a black person. Like, it's a bit too much for you to aim to be a lawyer. And so that kind of changed the trajectory of his life, led him down a life of crime, and that eventually got him arrested. In prison is where his hero's journey begins, where he finds out about Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, and through that he is transformed. He teaches himself how to read, how to write properly. He educates himself in prison. He talks about how he went through just about every single book he could find in these various prisons that he spent time in. And he comes out of jail a transformed man. Okay, in the middle here we have this guy here. His name is Chris Gardner. If you've ever seen The Pursuit of Happiness, it's based off that man's life. And so he had a very similar hero's journey where he grew up in a very poor, broke family. He didn't know who his father was. He had no direction in his life. And he was able to turn himself around and become a very successful businessman. Again, some of the fictional or like the stories, I really like Hiccup from the How to Train Your Dragon series. I think his journey over the span of 3 films is really amazing. You might recognize King Arthur there in the bottom right. I'm going to use that movie as quite a bit of a reference, and I think it does a tremendous job of going through the hero's journey. Okay, move on. So the hero's journey does look at 2 separate worlds here. You have the known, the unknown world. Right, so for many of you, when you left from junior high in grade 8, coming to high school in grade 9, you left your known world of junior high and you entered this unknown world of high school, right? And there's different expectations of you in high school. The environment is different, the teachers are different. Some of you might have been quite small last year, and you were walking around the school with some rather large grade 12s. These grade 12s might have been very boisterous, right? So you enter this unknown and chaotic world. Okay, you could also think of it as the ordinary world, your day-to-day mundane life, versus the extraordinary, if you choose to go on an adventure. And within a lot of stories, you have the normal world and the magical world, right? So part of the criticism with that King Arthur film we watched was that there's too much CGI, it's too magical, right? And it didn't connect with as many audiences, which I think is a pretty lame excuse for overlooking some very good quality storytelling. Okay, so the hero's journey is characterized by three main components. We have the departure, the initiation, and the return. We'll look at all three of these today. So the departure, now I'm specifically looking at Joseph Campbell's structure here. You have 5 main steps. You have the call to adventure, refusal of the call, supernatural aid, crossing the threshold, and belly of the whale. So we'll go over these steps real quick. Okay, the first two, the call to adventure and refusal of the call. You can experience this in your own life. So for myself, when I was leaving junior high, going into high school, I had a number of schools I could have chosen from. And it wasn't obvious which one would be the best fit. And so this is a call to adventure. And I chose to go to a high school that none of my friends were going to. Okay, that I didn't even know where it was until the first day of school. And so for me, that was an adventure of starting things brand new, in a new environment, in a new school, in a new area, that I knew I would have to bus like an hour until I moved. Right, so you get in life these various calls to adventure. For myself, another call to adventure was when my friend's family offered to repay the favor. So I took care of their son, and his parents offered to me, he said, hey, we really appreciate what you did for our son. Let us return this favor. Come to Israel, and we will let you live with us. We'll take care of you. We'll return this favor. Right, so I was called to adventure, to go and travel. That adventure led me around the world, and it completely transformed me as well. Now, in real life, because things are difficult and people get caught up in their day-to-day mundane, whatever's going on in their life, you also have this aspect of refusing the call, right? And so maybe your call is to, be a better student, right? To find a job, to pick up a new hobby, to go to the gym. And you get this opportunity to refuse the call. And the opportunity exists because it's easy to stay in our shell. It's easy to be the same old regular person that you are. When you start to grow, you expand out of your shell, and that new skin then interacts with air, and that can be very painful. It's very painful to grow, right? That's why babies cry sometimes, because they have growing pains, right? Maybe you had those when you were younger as well. And so it's a lot easier to see this in movies, right? Especially the King Arthur story. There's so many times where he just keeps refusing. He doesn't want to hold the sword with both hands. He doesn't want to look at his past. He doesn't even want to be king until he's shown by the Lady of the Lake, like what would happen if he refuses, right? So in movies, it's a lot easier to see the refusal of the call. In our life, it's easy to, put aside that we can distract ourselves with various things, whether it's our cell phone, whether it's with video games, whether it's with, eventually as people get older, they'll distract themselves with alcohol or drugs or, just TV, right? It's easy to really distract yourself from the fact that maybe you're not living your life to the fullest. Okay, so the refusal of the call exists for a variety of reasons. So typically in the initiation phase, or the call to adventure, you might find some obstacles in your life. So for myself, one of the major obstacles for me to go to Israel was, money. So when my friend's family first told me 2 years prior to me actually going on this trip, I laughed, smiled, I said, yeah, for sure, I'll come out to Israel one day. Knowing in mind that I had no idea how I'd get there, how I'd convince my parents to let me go, where I'd get the money from, how I'd sort this out, right? Now, for myself, the supernatural aid was, I eventually had moved out of my parents' place. I was living on my own with some roommates near the University of Alberta where I was going to school, and I couldn't really find a decent, suitable job. And then just somehow, some way or another, I found a job at the University of Alberta. I was actually a housekeeper. And that job over the summer made me enough money that I could go on this trip. And so for me, that was a supernatural aid. I still don't fully remember where I got the inspiration to go looking in a specific area for this job, right, online. But even when I was on my adventure, when I was on my trip around the world, I started meeting more and more people who were able to help me extend my journey and to help point me in a better direction, both for my personal life and also for the trip that I was on. Okay. We have some good examples here of a supernatural aid or some assistance. So, if you've seen Harry Potter, we all remember that scene where Hagrid kicks down the door and tells his family, like, no, like, Harry's coming with me, he's going to Hogwarts, right? Same with Mulan, if you've seen this film. The ancestors, they bring to life this stone dragon. And sure, he's a small little wee guy, but he's almost like a voice of conscience. He's a voice of courage to Mulan, right? And he protects her and he watches over her. And so, crossing the threshold here, we have a really good example. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship, they get to the point where Frodo stops and Sam asks him, like, why'd you stop? He's like, the next step I take here will continuously be the furthest step I've ever taken from the Shire, right? And so he recognizes that he's crossing the threshold into this unknown world, that he has no idea what's going to happen, right? And so for your own life, it's like, many of the grade 12s right now, they're about to experience this on July 1st when school's over, right? That they're in this unknown world where they can choose any adventure they would like to make. And it's not obvious which direction you should go in. And, many people choose to stay in the same spot, thinking that there's no cost. Like, hey, if I don't go on this adventure, that's okay, because I don't potentially fail, I don't potentially get hurt, whatever other negative emotions can come from it. What people fail to realize is that there's a cost to staying in the same spot, right? There's a price to be paid, and it's not obvious what that price is. It's kind of unique to everyone, right? So for myself, actually I'll get into that later on. Right, so for Frodo, it's like, had he just decided, I don't want to take that next step, I'm going to go back. Well, the price is that he just remains this kind of useless hobbit, right? Because we don't really know about any of the other hobbits. We only know about the 4 who are willing to go on this journey and go on this transformative adventure. Okay, and then, lastly, in the initiation phase, you have the belly of the whale, where it's like you've crossed the threshold, you're in this unknown world. So this could be like, day 1 of work, for those of you who started a job recently, or, if you remember your first day at work. It could be a first day of junior or high school, right? When you walk into the school and you see that there's so many other kids, and some of them are huge, and some of them are loud, and some of them are kind of mean, you are now in the belly of the whale, right? So we have 3 very good scenes here. So from Lord of the Rings, as they're walking along and they're just in this forest and they're carrying the Ring of Power, right? Like this magical item that everybody wants. They're in their jolly old lucky mindset, like, Shire times, everything will be okay. And then this wraith shows up, and then they're like, immediately they're like, uh-oh, like we could die right here, right now, instantly. They're in the belly of the whale. They're now realizing that we've accepted this journey, and everybody else who was a character in this quest, in this adventure, is also now a player in this game, right? And so for you, that might be at work, where it's like, okay, now you have to deal with your boss. And your boss isn't a teacher, which means they can yell at you, potentially they can swear at you, right? Which can be very uncomfortable, right? Maybe you are working with other adults and they have a very high expectation of competency, of success. And so when you start screwing up at work, it's not the same as when you screw up at school, right? Because the teacher has to, instruct you and guide you and continue to instruct you. It's not obvious to me how much needs to be done of that. Okay, we also have in the King Arthur story where the King Arthur is, being held hostage in front of a crowd, and it's like, okay, we're going to cut your head off, we're going to take your sword, we're going to end your myth. He's now in the belly of the whale. He has no idea if a supernatural aid will come to help him. He thinks he's going to die there, and then he's saved, right? And same with Mulan, when she hands over the scroll of acceptance, it's like, you're now in the army. It's time for you to train. It's time for you to be a man, because that's what they were looking for, right? There's no going back. If she deserts the army now, they'll kill her. They'll probably kill her family for deserting as well, for cowardice, right? So they're now in the belly of the whale, right? Many of you are in the belly of the whale of your adventure through high school, right? Okay, next, for the next section, I switched over to Christopher Vogler's adaptation of the hero's journey. Christopher Vogler is the guy behind The Lion King, the animated one. We watched that earlier this semester, right? But for this next stage, the initiation, he simplifies it to 4 steps. You have number 1, where you meet various tests. you meet allies or friends, and then you meet enemies as well, right? Because those exist in real life. 2, you have approach the innermost cave, you have the ordeal, and then you have the reward, right? It's kind of the middle, the climax of the adventure. Okay, so we'll go into this. So under the test, allies and enemies, we have a many variety of examples to choose from. These are just a couple I picked. So, here in Lord of the Rings, we have Boromir. He's tested by the ring. And so is Frodo. He's tested by his own group of friends, right? Because he wants to believe that, hey, everyone on this quest is pretty sound, they're pretty put together, and anyone can help. But here, he's tested. He's like, wait a minute. Should I be giving the ring to someone else? Like, who was tasked with carrying the ring? Frodo, right? And so he's got to be very careful about who he gives this burden to, because it's his burden, right? If he had given it to Boromir and Boromir did whatever with the ring, it's still Frodo's screw up because he's the one carrying the ring, right? It's his adventure, right? Or it's your adventure, right? And you're going to have to make these very complex, complicated decisions. You don't always know which one's right. Okay, like for myself, like when I was traveling, particularly in Israel, here and there I'd meet strangers, and it was very, especially this one particular day where I was walking towards a town before the sun had risen, and it was dark, and a car, like one lone car, came up behind me. I was going somewhere, right? So I was already had a plan. And this car stops, and this is very uncommon. Like what I learned when I was in Israel, when I was in Palestine, I was actually in Palestine when this happened, is that these people, they don't solicit you for their business. So if you're a taxi driver there and they see you walking, like they're not going to stop, even if they think you're a tourist. They'll let you do your thing, which is quite nice, quite convenient. Now, I'm walking along this road before the sun has risen, and a strange vehicle pulls up, and I look inside, right? And the first thing I see is that there's 3 dudes in this car, and they're basically telling me like, hey, like, where are you walking to? We'll drive you there. Like, we'll be your taxi. And in a split second, I have to make a choice. Do I insult these people by saying no, or do I take the risk of saying yes? And there's 3 dudes in there. Like, a 3-on-1 fight is not where you want to be. It's a very sketchy position to be in. And I felt that the best thing to do at that time was to say yes, to accept their offer, and to not spite them. And so I got into their car, and I think I made sure not to put the seatbelt on, because I knew okay, the guy who was sitting in the passenger seat, he went to the back, so there's 2 people in the back seat. If I put the seatbelt on, that's a very precarious position, because you can get choked out very easily. So I don't remember for sure if I didn't or didn't put the seatbelt on, but I remember I was kind of angled so I could see everybody else in the car, right, and keep my eye on them just in case. And then when I was in the car, they just asked me some basic questions like who I was, what my name was, where I was going, where I was from. And I answered cordially and politely. And thankfully for me, that test, because I truly think it was a test, it went well, right? Like I didn't spurn these people by telling them, no, screw off, like I'm going to walk. I wasn't very adamant with them. But it's not obvious when you're in these situations of how to handle the test, right? And so in your own personal life, you tell another story on camera, which might be the greatest. So my first year of university, my first semester, I was still trying to figure out how to be a good student and how to sort myself out. And so I wasn't prepared for my finals, and I had 2 final exams on the same day, right? In university, these exams could be 30 to 40% of your final mark, right? It's a very serious test. And so I didn't get to study for the second one in that day. And so I legitimately considered cheating on this test, to the point where I took a cheat sheet into the exam with me. And so, for myself, again, that was another test of, are you going to risk cheating? Because, if you get caught, it's immediately you are kicked out of the university. And because it's university, they'll also put on your record, hey, this person attempted to cheat on an exam, so it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get into another university. During the day of the test, I simply decided, you know what, I have my cheat sheet in my pocket, but I wouldn't dare pull it out for risk of that, right? But again, that's another test where it's not obvious what you should do. Maybe in that case, it was obvious. It's hey, don't cheat. Don't be an idiot, right? But you're going to face these different tests in your life when you go on various adventures. And it's complicated. It's not obvious what the right answer is and what you should be doing, right? But I would encourage you to trust your gut on that. Okay? You'll also, on your adventures, you'll meet allies, you'll meet enemies, right? So in Lion King, as Simba is exiled from his kingdom, from his father's kingdom on his father's death, he journeys out into to the desert, which is a place of death. He's in a place of despair. He has no hope. And then he is suddenly saved by, of all things, a warthog and a meerkat, right? Two things that he should be eating. But he's saved by these friends. And they raise him up and they take care of him. They allow him to grow into maturity and adulthood. So there's a lot of parallels between that and the King Arthur story. It's like the true king, or the true heir to the throne, sometimes has to be raised outside of the kingdom to keep them safe, right? These stories are identical with King Arthur, that you have the evil uncle that usurps the kingdom and is attempting to kill not only the true king, but the true king's son, and to end that line so that he can, have his little evil kingdom, right? So it's a very common theme in stories as well. If any of you know a little bit more about Jesus, you'll know that he wasn't born and raised, like he was born in Jerusalem, but he wasn't raised in that area. Like I just read about this recently. His family had to flee to Egypt, and they raised him in Egypt. And when he was old enough and kind of strong enough, let's say, as a person, that's when he came back to Israel, to Jerusalem, right? So it's a very common theme in people's lives, or storytelling narratives, right? You also meet enemies. So Mulan, she hasn't really met her enemy until the battle, right? She's training for this big test, and she doesn't quite frankly, she doesn't understand what she got herself into, right? She just knows, like, hey, I can't let my dad go to war. Like, my dad's old, he's broken. Like, I can't let him go to war. I need to go myself, right? She doesn't know what she's getting herself into until she meets, the leader of the Huns. And then, because she's appropriately trained herself and prepared herself, she's prepared to take on that enemy, that challenge, right? And, you will meet people in your life who don't have the best intentions for you, who might be malicious or literally psychopathic, and they will come into your life and they will tear things apart and pull things apart, right, to get their way. Like me and my friends are currently dealing with a psychopath right now, and it's not going well, right? So these things do happen, and you just don't expect them, because like I go through the world thinking most people are pretty reasonable, right? And some people are very good at hiding, let's say, their more malicious traits, which this person did, until it's ready and time for them to take action. And then when they do, then you realize, well, the carpet has been pulled out from under me, and you don't really know how to react and respond, right? So you will meet enemies in your life, in your adventure. Has anyone seen Emperor's New Groove? Anyone? A couple of you? Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. Right? So, Cusco as well, like, he is kind of an idiot, and he treats people poorly, and he treats one of his peasants, one of his subjects, poorly, and then lo and behold, like a day later, that same subject who he treated poorly, who he threatened to destroy his house and his family, he has to then rely on him to save his life, right? So be mindful that sometimes life can flip you on its head, right? You could be in a position of power and treat people poorly, and then next thing you know, you're under that person's thumb. Or it's very possible. Okay, next we have the approach to the innermost cave. So this is moving towards the center of what you set out for. Can be a very dangerous time. It's not obvious to me that these pictures are the best, these scenes are the best, but particularly so, let's start with the Lion King, right? So after Simba meets Nala, and he's given another reason to essentially be a king, to be a noble human being. Noble lion, right? But he represents a person. To sort himself out, that's when he is approaching the innermost cave, right? That's where he's healing the relationship with his inner child and with his father as well, and sorting that out. And so, he has Rafiki guide him on this spiritual journey and this spiritual vision to interact with his father, to, put him into a mental state where he is capable of achieving what he set out to be, right? Which was the king, right? He was supposed to be king. Similarly, at the bottom right, we have the King Arthur movie. So, you may or may not remember, and a lot of you are away the day we finished the movie, which kind of sucks. I don't mind showing it again, the rest. But you have this scene where, Arthur he just can't handle the responsibility and burden of this position. And he doesn't like having to see the people close to him die. And so he tries to get rid of the sword, and he throws it away. And he runs from it until the lady of the lake pulls him into the water and shows him, it's like, no, like, this is what you need to see. This is what will happen if you continue to refuse your call. Okay, and you know, she shows him a vision of destruction. And so it is a very dangerous time for him, right? Because he runs away from his people. He runs out to the forest. He could have gotten caught. He could have gotten killed, whatever the situation was, right? And, you know, this can happen in your own life. You know, there's, you know, for the people like myself who travel to the Holy Land, to Israel, or wherever that is for you, wherever you're compelled to go. It's like, particularly though with Israel, there's a reason why a lot of people lose their minds. Like, they can't handle that truth that life is giving them. Right? We can speak from personal experience. It's very difficult to grapple with that. You know, I almost lost my own mind as well out there in the desert. But fortunately, I had help that brought me back. Right? For me, it was my mother. Right? And you know, so as you're moving towards that center of your being, you're going to be challenged with, you know, the potential for losing your mind, like literally going insane, to be deviated off your path as well. You're going to be offered the opportunity to take the easy route, and you know, you might take it, and I don't really know what to say to that. It's not worth it, right? To take the more difficult route that encourages you to grow as a person. Okay, I think last in this section is you have the ordeal, right? So this is the biggest challenge the hero faces on their journey. And now this is a lot more easier in movies, right? Because the movies only cover a very short time frame of a person's life, right? Whereas like in real life, you know, the ordeal is continuous, right? You have ordeals every day potentially, maybe small ones, and then you have more major ordeals as time goes on, right? So all of you will have a major ordeal on your high school adventure, right? We call those diplomas. And it's not obvious if there'll be 30% of your final grade when you take them, or 10%, right? But it is an ordeal. It's something you prepare for, you study for, and you know, you have to deal and grapple with the fact that you're going to write that. Okay, for university, it's like class by class, right? You have your final, you have your major essays, and you know, that could cover 60 to 70% of your course mark, just 2 assessments, right? In real life, it's a lot more subtle. You know, these things happen in a smaller scale, and also because it's happening to you in your life, sometimes it's not obvious what stage you're going through or why it's happening to you, but understanding the hero's journey has helped me to better understand these different difficult stages in my life, right? And it helps me to persevere through them, right? Because, you know, it's easy to point out for Simba that he's going through the ordeal when he's fighting, you know, a death match with his uncle. Right? Or Harry is fighting a death match with Voldemort. Unfortunately, his photo's like very bad quality. Right? The major ordeal for Frodo is when he's standing over the volcano, the lava. He's holding the ring and he's tempted to take the ring. And, you know, to an extent, like, he fails, right? Frodo does fail, right? Because he puts on the ring. But then, you know, Gollum fights him for it and bites off his finger and whatnot. So some of these stories are quite interesting, right? And I would say that the Lord of the Rings is very true and accurate to real life. It's like, even at your biggest obstacle and ordeal, like, you might fail, but still succeed in the end, right? Like, whatever else happens, whatever, let's say, God had planned for you. Okay, but the ordeal is also a matter of resurrection, of death and rebirth, right? So you could look at the story of Jesus as it is in the Bible, as very similar to this hero's journey, where he goes through his major ordeal. The Romans and the Jews at the time want to crucify him. Right, he goes through a form of death and resurrection. Right, he comes back. I'm not going to tell you anymore because my understanding differs from the Catholic understanding. Right, it could also be metamorphosis, or changing, becoming a better person. Right, even Harry. For those of you who've seen the Harry Potter films, you know, there is the scene where Harry goes out to Voldemort. He gets hit, and then he's in that like train station with Gandalf. Not Gandalf, sorry. With Dumbledore, right? Like, Harry technically died there, and he had the opportunity to stay living in death, or to go back to his reality, right? So he has this ordeal, he has this metamorphosis, and becomes a better person from it. Okay. Oh no, here we go. And then lastly, once you've dealt with the ordeal, you know, you have your reward, right? And these things can happen instantaneously. Sometimes they can happen over time. right? It's not obvious, but that reward does exist, and it's up to you to determine what that is. So for myself, like a mini little side quest in my adventure around the world was overcoming my social anxiety. And so, I made a little game out of how to do that. And so the hostel I was staying at in Jerusalem, I made a little game for myself. I said, okay, to overcome my social anxiety, I need to do something. And what I decided was if I made eye contact with a person for more than 2 seconds, I had to go and introduce myself to them and ask them their name and where they're from, right? And so that was just a small little game that I played. In a matter of 3 days, I had introduced myself to about 100 different people. I had completely overcome my social anxiety. And the reward was that the day before I left that hostel to move on, me and a dear friend of mine were sitting on the rooftop. And as people would come and check out the roof, see what was going on, I knew all their names. So I would say, hey, call them by name, tell them, come on out. Like, we're hanging out at the roof, bring a chair, like we'll all sit out here. And the reward was that there was essentially like 50 people, like 40 to 50 people sitting at that rooftop, all because I knew their names, right? And so everyone had a very wonderful night there. We got to learn about each other, share some conversations, and it was a magical night, right? So that was one small reward that came by very quickly, right? And so, you're going through your adventure of high school. If you successfully complete this adventure, the reward at the end of it is you get a little diploma, right? You get a little certificate that says that you can, maybe move on from this stage of your life, right? And you can ascribe whatever value you want to that. So lastly, we have the return, okay? And we're going back to Joseph Campbell for this part. There's 6 stages here. You have the refusal of the return, the magic flight, rescue from without, crossing of the return threshold, master of the 2 worlds, and freedom to live. Okay, we'll look at these. Okay, so refusal to return and the magic flight. So this scene and these movies kind of hop back and forth and just finding best images for concepts. So, you have Simba, and he's living in Hakuna Matata land, and he doesn't want to go back to the kingdom. He doesn't want to fight Scar. He doesn't want to face his mother or Nala. He doesn't want to face the death of his father or his own incapability or his own whatever role he played in. And so he doesn't want to return to his old life, right? And he lives out there, and he lives a pretty pathetic life. I mean, it's like a full-grown lion living with a warthog and a meerkat, and he's eating bugs, right? Like, imagine if you saw a lion out in the jungle and it was just like scavenging for bugs instead of being an awesome lion. Like, you wouldn't really respect this lion, right? Similarly, if it was a person and they, instead of choosing to take responsibility and accountability for their life, they continue to choose to put blame on other people, and they continue to choose the easy route, right? So they, choose to not study, they fail their exams, and they blame like, oh, well, the teacher didn't know how to teach, and oh, I can never pay attention in class because it's boring, right? It's a two-way street. You could also say, oh man, like I don't have enough money to do the things I want because the employer won't pay enough. It's like, well, it's still your responsibility to go out and find a better job and to figure out the best value you can provide to the world and be compensated for it, right? So many people refuse this return. Looking at more real-world examples, so I met a friend while I was traveling, and she had been traveling for 2, maybe 3 years, and it became obvious that she was just avoiding going home, right? And learning that, I learned that through learning why she left in the first place. She left Australia because a friend of hers, she had wanted to travel, and a friend of hers kept poking her like, you're never actually going to do this. Like, you keep talking about it, you're never going to do it. And one day she decided, what, screw you, I'm going to prove you wrong. And she left on this journey. 2 to 3 years later, it then became a question of like, should I go back? Like, I don't really know what I'm doing out here, still traveling. Like, I've kind of experienced all the things I've wanted to. And, maybe it's time for me to pick up my life again. And I was able to encourage her. We'll actually look at that later on. But I was able to encourage her to be courageous enough to return home and kind of pick up a normal life and balance the two things, right? But many people do get lost on the adventure simply because, the adventure can be very fun. Or avoiding the responsibility of the adventure or whatever you left to go on the adventure for can be very easy as well, right? Like, between going on an adventure and sitting home, going to work and paying bills, it's like most people would probably choose the adventure. But realistically, you have to do both, Okay, you also have the magic flights here. So when you don't refuse the adventure, typically there's some sort of help or assistance that gets you back to where you need to go as well. And so we have the eagles here in Lord of the Rings, and we also have Buckbeak here as well, which helps Harry and Hermione out in some of the films in particular scenes. Right, for myself, the magic flight was when I was traveling. I was in Japan. This was like a week after New Year's. I got a call from my mom saying essentially that I need to return home for my sister's wedding that got pushed forward very early. She said, well, so I asked her, I said, when's the wedding? She said, Saturday. And I laughed. I said, which Saturday? She's like, I think you know which Saturday I'm referring to. And it was like, 5-6 days later. And so for me, the magic flight was basically just flying home, right? Finding a last minute ticket, arriving in Canada Friday the 13th of all days in the middle of January. It was -40, it was awful. Right? And I got home at like 2-3 in the morning, and I decided to surprise my family, which might not have been the best thing to do because I was very panicked, ringing the bell outside the house at 3 in the morning and -40, like, somebody please wake up and answer the door because I don't want to freeze out here. Right? But you can have your magic flight, maybe more so on adventures you go on after high school, right? You're quite limited with what you can do while you're still in high school, you're still young, right? Okay, so rescue from without. Sometimes you need an external force to assist you in, give you a little kick in the butt to get you home, right? So we have Rafiki and we have the sorceress from King Arthur that are attempting to rescue the hero, to encourage the hero to stay on their path, to sort out what it is. And both these characters do quite the same thing, right? Both the sorceress and Rafiki, I forget her name, but the sorceress and Rafiki, they both put the king, the born king, we'll call him, as they do in the King Arthur film. They put him into almost like a psychedelic trance to get him to interact with something within him that he's not capable of looking at in a sober state, we'll call it, right? And so, I played this role for someone else. I didn't give him a psychedelic vision or anything, but just that encouragement and talking this my friend through why she was continuing to travel rather than going home. And it was quite fascinating because I don't think she was so much convinced by what I had to say, but a mixture of what I had to say. And then she eventually had a dream where she went back to Australia for a particular thing. And that dream actually ended up manifesting itself as well. She said she had a dream where she went back home. She flew to Darwin, which is an island in the north, well, not an island, it's a city in the north of Australia, and she said that in the dream, she was there for a wedding. And that's actually exactly what led her back to Australia. She went back to that city and attended the wedding of one of her relatives. Right, but sometimes we have a mentor or a guide or someone who's looking out for us who guides us back onto the journey home as well, because it's just as important as the journey starting the adventure. Okay, then we have, the crossing of the return threshold. It's like a very abrupt return home, right? So for me, after having traveled for 4.5 months on a very spiritual and memorable journey that changed me as a person, the abrupt stop was like being outside my home at 3 in the morning and -40 ringing the bell, like, damn, like, get me into this house right now. Like, I'm done with this trip. I want to be in a warm house, right? And for our heroes, we have I was going to call them goblins, and they're not goblins, they're hobbits, right? The hobbits are at the bar, and they're like, okay, like, cheers, we survived this ordeal, right? We are now hailed as heroes throughout the entire realm, right? As the king says, no one bows to them because of what they did. You have King Arthur, right? At the end of the movie, he's building this round table. It's like the abruptness of like, okay, like, the uncle's dead, the kingdom is mine. Now it's like the management of the kingdom into the future. Right, it's a very abrupt stop to the journey. You also have Emperor Cusco, like, meeting Pacha's wife, and it's like the abruptness of like mundane life. It's like, okay, like, it's time for me to stop being a little boy and start being a king, start being a man, and treating the kingdom as such. Okay, and in doing so, it's like you have to interact with your subjects, right? You have to know who they are. In Harry Potter, we see like that scene, which really pulls on the heartstrings of. All of them are old. It's like their adventure's done, right? And now their kids are going on their adventure, right? We have Master of the Two Worlds. So you know, ideally you want to continue to go on these adventures to continue to grow as a person, and you want to continue to return to this mundane life so that you can bring whatever you learned on your adventure back into the world you exist in. Right? That's why I'm very grateful for my journey around the world, because it brings a lot of experience and it brings a lot of just competence to my teaching, despite the fact that I haven't been teaching very long and I'm quite young myself. Right? But having gone on that adventure makes me a more complete human being. And I look forward to my next few adventures. And they don't all have to be as grandiose as traveling around the world, right? It can be a small adventure, right? Like I started a YouTube page where this video is going to go. And that's a little adventure in itself of figuring out how can I be most effective in teaching? What impact can I have on the lives of my students? And what value can I return to them? In our films, you know, we have Harry where he breaks the master wand. You know, he recognizes like he doesn't need this magical item, this powerful wand to help sort out the world that he now lives in. He has the skills to deal with this world, with the adventure he went on and who he was as a person and the people he brought along with him. Similarly with King Arthur, you know, his phrase, why have enemies when you can have friends? It's like, okay, like we don't need the magical sword to sort our problems. We can actually just bring people to the table and we can get them involved. And if we can do that, let's say, effectively, then, you know, it saves us from this evil, tyrannical acquisition of power that his uncle went on. Okay, freedom to live as well. So the freedom to live is an acceptance of death. It's freedom to live in the moment, right? So our hero is now in tune with both the magical world, the normal world, right, or chaos and unknown, and they're living in harmony within both. And so it essentially just allows you to just be in that present moment. You know, I would say from my trip around the world, I'm still benefiting from this ability to be present in the moment. Like I'm not worried about my past, I'm not too worried about my future, I'm just here. Right, for the most part. Sometimes I get distracted with other thoughts, but generally speaking, right? So we have King Arthur where it's like in that last moment, he's finally able to deal with his horrific past of having his uncle kill his father and his mother, you know, and his aunt basically to usurp the throne, right? And we could also do a deep dive analysis into how this King Arthur story helps us to understand how to deal with our own human history, right? Like in Canada particularly, we're really going through it with, I would say we haven't stopped going through it, unfortunately, but how to deal with Canada's horrific past of what we did to, you know, Indigenous communities here, right? And you know, we're constantly, or whoever else, whatever else, you know, we're constantly having to think of and evaluate the past. But so again, coming back to the stage, because that's a different tangent, we have the freedom to live. So Harry, you know, he's at this crossroads where he can choose death, he can choose life. And in choosing life and having given up death, it's like it gives him the freedom to live in his life and to make the appropriate decisions he needs to overcome his grand like enemy, right, which is Voldemort. Right? Similarly, in Lord of the Rings, you know, Frodo and Sam just accept death. They just lay down. They're like, all right, like we finished the quest. You know, the evil is gone, and I guess we're just gonna have to die, but that's okay, right? Because they've now left the world in good hands, or rather, removed the grip of evil around the world. And it's like they can accept dying in that moment. It gives them the courage to do that. You know, my theory is that a lot of people who are really fearful of death, who are like very not having a good time, let's say, on their deathbed, I think part of it is that they didn't go on a hero's journey. They didn't go on an adventure. And they chose to live a mundane life. And they chose to not take that risk. Right? And so when you get to your deathbed, you have this fear and insecurity that you didn't live a life full enough. That there were things left undone. That there are questions remaining to be answered. Right? And that can be incredibly painful. I can't quite speak to that experience. I don't quite know someone in that situation. As you can tell, I haven't been there myself. Okay, so some implications or applications of the hero's journey. Like, you know, and it's easy to ignore this stuff because we pull it out of stories and movies, and it's like, well, that's just a movie. Like, life is miserable. Life is terrible. Well, you know, if all you focus on life is the misery and the terribleness, like that's what your life is going to be. Right? Focus on that magical adventure aspect of it. You know, life truly is like a video game. It's like you can kind of like you're your own like think of it as like a mass multi-online role-playing game, right? You're your own character. You know, it takes you a very long time to level up your skills, whatever they are. And you have to be the one who trains them up one by one individually, right? You got to spend a long time, maybe 3 months to 10 years learning these skills, right? And you get to go on different adventures and fulfill different quests, right? The reality is, though, many people choose to just play one, well, it's not even an adventure. Many people just choose whatever was given to them. So I know a lot of people who went from, you know, elementary school, junior high, high school, university, they maybe didn't even decide themselves what they wanted to do in university. They just did whatever was told to them. And then they end up in a job that they don't like, and they work that job forever until they are old, crusty, and die because, you know, they're not willing to take that risk to go on a new adventure, right? They're deciding to play life in one path, and then, you know, they have this kind of discomfort, this misery with, oh man, life sucks because, you know, this is how life was for me. It's like, well, you know, had you chosen to go on different quests and different paths, sure, you might make less money. Sure, you might spend time in your life broke. Or sure, you might go through some very difficult things, but you also go on an adventure. And an adventure is very exciting. And each adventure you go on makes the next one easier to go on. And the more adventures you've gone on in your life, the more robust human being you are, right? The more things you've experienced in life, the more competency you have, and the more effectiveness you have in life. Okay? So, despite the fact that we really pull it out of stories and movies, you know, this is an adventure that people go on in real life. And so you gotta ask yourself, well, what came first? The movies or the human stories? And the answer to that question is it's the human stories, right? We observe these, or well, at least our ancestors observed these things that happened in the lives of their peers, and then they started writing about them. And then over time, over potentially 10 to 25,000 years, you know, we've narrowed down this very clean-cut story of the hero's journey. And, you know, ultimately you got to ask yourself, you know, what else are you going to do with your life? What better thing could you do than go on that adventure, right? Whatever that happens to be. Okay? And that's where I'll leave you with. Thank you.